So, welcome back to another episode of Grading the Films. This time, we're looking at one of my favorite films that I've wanted to cover for a while but haven't ever quite gotten around to it. But now we are going to get around to it, and that film is Interstellar. So, to start out with, I need to give my usual disclaimer that color grading isn't everything to the look of a film. You also have to consider cinematography, lighting, set design, costume design, all that sort of stuff, because all of that affects the look of a film just as much, and in fact, probably even more than the color grading does. The color grading is just that last 10%. But I've given that disclaimer enough times. I think if you've watched any episode in this series, you've heard that disclaimer already. So let's go ahead and dive in. So pretty typical for these episodes. I've got 3 clips we're going to take a look at. I will pull it up real quick so you can see. So this first one is fairly early in the film. It's by this lake. We've got some greenery, all that. Next is on the ocean planet that they visit. So, a lot of sea. And then lastly, we've got ice. And so I've got 3 similar clips: ocean, ocean, snow. Not perfect, obviously, but close enough that we should be able to get an idea of what the color grading is like. Before we dive in, I want to talk about how Interstellar was shot, and this is something that I talk about in all my episodes. Normally I would go to shotonwhat.com, which lists information, but you can go look there yourself if you want to. But Interstellar was primarily shot on 35mm film and 70mm IMAX film. Now, coincidentally, I didn't do this on purpose, but the 3 clips I selected ended up all being IMAX shots. And the way you can tell is that the 35mm shots have a 2.35 super wide aspect ratio, while the IMAX shots have a taller aspect ratio. And on the HD releases of the film, those taller IMAX shots, they're about 4:3, I believe, the original stock, but they're cropped to 16:9 for the home DVD HD release, all that. So the 3 shots you'll see are all 16:9 because they're all shot on IMAX. So now going in here, the first thing we should do is take a look at our scopes. So I'm going to move that up real quick so you can see the scopes down here. So if we look at this shot, we can see this is actually a very dark shot. Our highlights are at about 70% brightness. It's shifted towards red. You can see there's more red in the highlights. But there's actually very little red. There's some blue and green in the shadows, and you can see if we look at the water and the sky here, those are actually shifted towards teal. So we've got a kind of an idea of how that looks. We can also see the shadows are clipped pretty heavily, like in his hair and some of those shadows. It's a very contrasty shot. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to throw on Film Convert, which is for those of you, the first thing we should do, I take that back, the first thing we should do is color correct the image, so I will do that color correction real quick. Alright, so quick correction. I didn't do too much to balance the color, I just pretty much just balanced the contrast. But anyway, now let's throw on Film Convert. And so Film Convert, I've used this plugin quite a bit. I use it a lot. I like it a lot. It's a film emulation plugin. And a cool thing about it is that it has different color profiles which you can use to help get better and more accurate results depending on the camera you have. So I shot this on a G7, so I can use the GH4 profile to get some more similar results. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the IMAX footage is 70mm footage. Now, the larger your film stock is, the smaller the film grain is, which means that, well, with Film Convert, if you look at it, our largest option is 35mm full frame, which is about half the size of IMAX footage, which means that we have grain that is twice the size of what it would be in IMAX footage, which is kind of a bad thing. It means we can't perfectly replicate it, but we're kind of stuck with that. I have yet to find any film emulation plugins that will let you replicate the look of IMAX footage. So to kind of balance that, I'm going to bring down the gain, or the amount of grain, to 50%. The IMAX footage would have smaller grain, not less grain, but that's the closest we can do to kind of balance that out. Now, as for stock, again, we don't have a stock that perfectly emulates the IMAX stock, because that just doesn't exist. You'd have to actually shoot IMAX footage, which, is not something that's super practical for most people. So we're just going to stick with the default Kodak Viz 3 stock, which is pretty similar to what the IMAX stock is, I'm guessing. I don't actually know. I'm not an expert on celluloid, but should give us fairly similar results, and we can just, fix any problems with the digital color correction anyway. That's the power of digital color correction. So again, the first things we notice, very high contrast, very dark shot with teal, with our blues turned towards teal. Now we could do this a few ways. We could take our lift, which is our shadows, and just kind of push those towards teal, but as you can see, this is pushing the whole image towards teal, which isn't really what we want. So I'll come back to that, but the first thing we're going to do actually is we're going to go into our log and bring down our highlight. The reason is that we've got, you can see on our scopes, we've got a few little pieces peeking up. So by bringing down our highlights, we can kind of tame those as we go into our primaries. And we're going to bring up, actually we're going to have to dial that back a little bit. And then we can go into our primary wheels and bring up our highlight to 70%. Go back into our log, bring our, it's down, and that's pretty good. Actually, I'm gonna balance it out. And this bright point right here, these bright points, I think is this buoy right here. So we're just gonna have to deal with that. And that's something that I could track and deal with, but we're just gonna ignore that and pretend it's not there. And bring up highlights about 70%. Bring down our shadows. And now I think what we're going to do to bring out some of that teal, you can already see our sky is kind of teal. Our shadows are too. But we're going to go into our hue curve. And what we can do, oh, that's not what we want. You can see we can take our hue versus hue, we can take our blues and we can just selectively push those towards teal. We could do the opposite, push the other way. We're just going to kind of push them towards teal. And bring out that kind of teal look. And so now going back, we're closer, but again, this shot is very dark. So to balance that out, we could take our midtones, which is our gamma, and kind of bring those down. Even bring our lift down a bit and crush our blacks. Maybe a little less than that. All right, so now it's looking pretty close. It's not perfect, but it's a little closer. And I think another thing we can do is bring down our saturation. If you look at this, this is very saturated, especially the greens. And what I might actually do is go into our not our lumens. Where is our curve? Hue versus saturation. And what this does is this controls the saturation. So for example, I could just select my greens here and just bring down, you can see I'm controlling the saturation of the greens. I could widen that out a bit. And so now, as I'm controlling this, you can see I've brought down the saturation a little bit, particularly in the greens. But then overall, I might just take our overall saturation control and bring that down to like 35 maybe a little more than that, maybe 40. And so now we go back and forth. Again, not perfect, but looks fairly close. And what I might actually do, you'll notice the sky is pretty dark. I think our sky is still brighter here. might just bring down the gain even more. And I mean, that's pretty close overall. Not perfect, but again, it can only be so close. Considering we're not shooting on IMAX. But I would say that's pretty close. We could even bring down the shadows a bit more. But like, yeah. Maybe even push a little bit more towards teal. There we go. I think that looks pretty close. Again, not perfect, but we're not going for perfect here. We're going for close enough. So let's go to our second shot, which is this water shot. And again, we've got this shot. Already, there's quite a few differences. This has some very bright reds. It's partly cloudy. There's a sunset. This is completely overcast. Obviously, it's just water. There's no land. But we're going to kind of ignore those differences and just see how close we can get it. So if we look at our scopes, once again, you can see we're about as bright as we can possibly be. And I'll actually get rid of that to show you. We're about as bright as we can possibly be, but everything is shifted towards red and the highlights. Our shadows are pretty well balanced, maybe leaning a bit towards teal. But as you can see, our shadows are not perfectly at the bottom. We're a little soft clipped with not necessarily even soft clipped, because they're not really clipped, but our shadows aren't as dark as they could be. So we're going to go back over here. And again, the first thing we're going to do is correct it. And again, we're going to throw on film convert. We're going to choose our camera. In this case, it is a DJI camera. So again, the first thing, if we go back, everything in the highlights is leaning a bit towards red, so we control that with the gain. And there we go. And everything's leaning a bit towards teal in the shadows. And again, our shadows aren't completely clipped. So now overall, we're pretty close, I would say, already. If we compare the two, if you look, completely lost my ability to talk for a second there. The closest comparison we have in these two, because the sky is completely different, but if we look at the water as kind of a point of reference, our water is pretty close. And I would say we could even push our water a bit more towards green. But I think the color is pretty close. But one thing that's different is saturation, obviously. So we could bring down the saturation quite a bit, actually, especially in the sky. But again, we're kind of ignoring the sky. So if you look, I think the water, if we're using the water as a point of reference, I think we've gotten very close indeed. And I could, if I wanted to. So if we're just looking at the water, you can see this in our scopes is our sample of the water. And if we do the same thing over here, and try to get a sample where the sun isn't so bright, you can see that overall the color and brightness balance between the two, if we're looking at the scopes, is pretty dang close. Not perfect, but pretty dang close. So I think I'm happy with our comparison there. Again, ignoring the sky, because the sky looks quite a bit different. But let's go to our last shot, which is, this was shot in a glacier. Closest thing we've got to a glacier for comparison is a snowy, wintry scene. But we're going to try and see what we can do regardless. So first thing, we're going to correct and then throw on film convert. So now if we look at our scopes comparing the two shots, you can see this shot is a very bright, very low contrast shot. There's a lot of, first of all, there's a lot of like dirt and debris and stuff in the snow, which kind of adds some darkness to the snow. We don't really have that in our shot, but we do have like these trees and fences and cars and all that. But if we look at our scopes, we can see everything again is tilted a bit towards red in the highlights, a bit towards teal in the shadows, and very low contrast. Our darkest is kind of about 10%, our brightest is kind of about in 90%. So the first thing we can do is just balance out like that, kind of lower our contrast, and we're going to use our gamma control to kind of shift everything a bit brighter, and then push our highlights towards red, and then push our shadows towards kind of a teal. Bring that down a bit. And I think these are by far the two most like dissimilar images. I think again we could bring down the saturation in this shot. These are two very different, but again, if we look at the overall color and contrast balance, I think those are pretty similar. What I could do is like up the contrast here, and then balance that out with these controls to kind of bring out the contrast a bit more. Even if I look at the shot, it looks like our gamma is a bit towards purple, so I could do that very, very subtly. But that's even too much. There we go. But if I disable that, enable that, you can see gotten pretty close. That purple might have been wrong. I think it's actually towards green, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I think I should just leave it how I had it. But overall, yeah, I think that's pretty good. So again, these aren't perfect, but we're not working with footage from the same source. We're not. Oh, this one actually. I have this box. Yeah, I'll just be lazy and make it cover everything. But I was applying the grade to just part of the image because I had that box popped up. But anyway, there we go. That looks better. But if we compare everything, it looks fairly similar. And if you've got IMAX footage, which I doubt you do, but if you do, you'll have more success than I will. But if you also have footage that looks closer to what Interstellar does look like, then that's going to give you more of an advantage as well compared to me. But hopefully this gave you some ideas for different directions you can go and how you can look at footage from any film really, but specifically from Interstellar, look at footage from that and kind of analyze how you can help replicate that look. But anyway, that is it for this video. So if this video helped you, if it was interesting, if you learned more about how the look of Interstellar was developed, how you can replicate it yourself, hit that like button. If not, feel free to hit the dislike button. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those down in the comment section down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, please hit that subscribe button.